The thermal alarm did not scream. It let out a low, rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the floor of Outpost 9, a sound designed to wake a sleeper without inducing the kind of panic that leads to fatal mistakes. I was out of my bunk before the third pulse. My hand instinctively found the grip of my pulse carbine, the cold polymer of the weapon a familiar comfort against my palm. Static hummed in my ear as I keyed the internal comms. "Zero contact," I whispered, my voice a gravelly rasp in the pre-dawn silence. "Ilara, get to the hard point. Now." The small room was illuminated only by the faint, bioluminescent glow of the fungal cultures lining the shelves. In the dim light, I saw her move. Ilara Veen did not scramble. She moved with a fluid, haunting grace that even 3 months in this frozen hell had not stripped away. Her skin, normally a soft amber, was pulsing a frantic, rhythmic violet, the Aurelian physiological response to acute fear. "Soren?" Her voice was a wisp of silk. "They found us, didn't they?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I moved to the viewport, pulling the thermal shutter back just a fraction of an inch. Outside, Krios Prime was a study in monochromatic cruelty. The horizon was a jagged line of obsidian peaks beneath a sky of permanent, bruised purple. The razor wind was whipping crystal snow into dervishes that obscured the perimeter sensors, but my HUD showed 3 distinct heat signatures. They were moving in a delta formation, using the jagged ice outcroppings for cover. "Professionals." "Sector 4 is breached," I said, checking the charge on my carbine. "They used a localized EMP on the outer fence. Smart, but not smart enough to know I have a secondary analog loop." "Soren, the data," Ilara said, her hands moving over her console. "I need 5 minutes to finalize the encryption. If they get the sequence, Ethelgard will never be able to restart the atmospheric scrubbers." "You have 3, I told her, my eyes never leaving the thermal ghosts outside. "Get into the subfloor locker. If the door goes, you don't breathe, you don't move. You wait for my signal." I stepped into the narrow corridor that connected the living quarters to the laboratory. The walls were thin, prefabricated sheets of reinforced alloy that groaned under the weight of the external ice. This place was a tomb waiting for a lid. I had spent 15 years in the orbital shock troops, and I knew the smell of a losing position. It smelled like recycled oxygen and ozone. I reached the main airlock and pressed my back against the wall, checking the tactical display on my wrist. 2 targets were converging on the primary seal. The third was circling toward the ventilation intake. "Tango 1 and 2 at the front door," I muttered to myself. "You want to dance? Let's dance." I triggered the remote detonation for the external flares. White light, brilliant and blinding, erupted across the ice fields. Through the exterior cameras, I saw 2 figures in matte black tactical gear stagger, their night vision optics overwhelmed by the sudden photic bloom. It was the only opening I needed. I didn't use the carbine yet. The sound of a pulse discharge would give away my exact position in the cramped hallways. Instead, I drew my vibro blade. I hit the airlock release, and the pressure difference hissed as the door slid open. The first operative was halfway through the threshold when I caught him. I drove the blade through the seal of his neck joint, the vibration hum cutting through bone and synth fiber like a hot wire through fat. He went down without a sound, his nervous system shorting out before he could even register my presence. The second one was faster. He swung a short-barreled scattergun toward my chest, but I was already inside his guard. I grabbed the barrel, redirecting the blast into the ceiling, and slammed my helmeted forehead into his visor. The glass cracked. I followed up with a heavy kick to his knee, feeling the joint shatter under my boot, then finished him with a precise strike to the temple. 2 down. A sharp metallic bang echoed from the rear of the station. The third one. The vents. I turned and sprinted back toward the lab, my boots clattering on the metal grating. I burst through the door just as a vent cover hit the floor. A slim figure in a Sanguine Directorate suit dropped down, rolling to her feet with a grace that matched Ilara's. She had a silenced pistol leveled at the subfloor locker where Ilara was hiding. "Check your 6, I growled. She spun, firing 3 rounds in a tight cluster. I felt the impact on my shoulder plate, a dull thud that sent a spike of white heat through my arm. I ignored it, closing the distance in 3 long strides. I didn't want to shoot. The lab was filled with volatile gases and Alara's precious samples. We collided, a chaotic tangle of limbs and armored plates. She was fast, faster than any human I'd ever fought. She went for my throat with a serrated combat knife, but I caught her wrist, twisting until I heard the snap of the radius. She didn't scream. These directorate ghosts were conditioned to ignore pain. I slammed her against the heavy metal desk, pinning her down. I looked into her visor, seeing my own scarred reflection for a second before I drove my fist into the center of the glass. She went limp. I stood there for a moment, chest heaving, the adrenaline beginning to recede and leaving behind the sharp, biting sting of the wound in my shoulder. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the whistling of the wind through the broken vent. "Ilara," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Clear." The floor panel slid back. Ilara emerged, her violet skin slowly fading back to its natural amber, though her veins were still flickering with a nervous, golden light. She looked at the carnage in the room, then at me. Her eyes went straight to my shoulder. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice a mix of terror and clinical observation. "I've had worse," I grunted, though the blood was already soaking through my thermal underlayer. "We need to move. This was a scouting party. The heavy hitters will be here by 1800 hours." She didn't move. She stood there looking at the fallen operative, then at her hands which were stained with the dust of the broken lab. "They won't stop, Soren," she whispered. "Not until I'm dead or they have the mycelium." "Why are you still here? Your contract had an escape clause for high-intensity orbital intervention. You could have left 2 weeks ago when the first drones appeared." I looked at her, really looked at her. Her long, elegant ears were drooping, a sign of Aurelian exhaustion. She looked small in her oversized thermal coat, a fragile light in a world of absolute cold. "The credits are good," I said, the lie tasting like ash. "You're a terrible liar, Soren Voss." "Maybe," I said, turning toward the kitchen area to find the medical kit. "But I'm a world-class guardian. Now pack your samples. We're burning this station and heading for the ghost light. We have 3 kilometers of open ice to cross, and the wind is picking up." I walked away before she could see the expression on my face. I hadn't stayed for the credits. I had stayed because for the first time in 5 years, the silence of the void didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a shared secret, and I wasn't ready to let that secret die. The memory of our first meeting was as cold as the ice outside, yet it felt like a lifetime ago. 82 days. That was the official count on my wrist chronometer since I had stood in the pressurized docking bay of Nixara Station, watching the shuttle from Ethelgard hiss as it equalized. I had been hired through a series of encrypted channels, the kind that dealt in deniable assets and high-risk extraction. My instructions were simple. Protect Dr. Ilara Veen. Ensure her research remains confidential. Ask no questions. I remember the way she looked when she stepped off that shuttle. She wasn't the typical high-strung academic I was used to guarding. She looked like a ghost, pale, thin, and carrying a single reinforced transport case like it contained her own soul. Her amber eyes had scanned the crowded bay, landing on me with a mixture of hope and profound suspicion. "Mr. Voss?" she had asked, her voice melodic despite the industrial clatter of the docks. "I'm the one you paid for," I had replied, my eyes scanning the crowd behind her for tails. "We have 10 minutes before your transit window closes. Move." I hadn't been kind. I hadn't been welcoming. In my line of work, attachment was a luxury that usually got you a one-way ticket to a shallow grave. I treated her like cargo, high-value, fragile cargo, but cargo nonetheless. Krios Prime had been her choice for a hiding spot, a moon so remote and inhospitable that most star charts simply listed it as a navigational hazard. It was a place where people went to disappear, or to die. The first few weeks at Outpost 9 had been a study in mutual silence. The station was a cramped, 2-room dome. We shared a kitchen the size of a storage locker and a sleeping quarter that was even smaller. I spent my days calibrating sensors and running perimeter drills. She spent hers hunched over a microscope, whispering to fungal cultures that pulsed with a soft, eerie light. The shift happened during the 14th night. The primary heating core had seized up. In the vacuum-thin atmosphere of Krios Prime, the temperature drops so fast it can crack the reinforced glass of the viewports. Within an hour, the internal temperature had plummeted to 10 degrees Celsius. By 2 in the morning, I could see my own breath fogging the air inside my helmet. I had been sitting in the chair by the door, wrapped in a thermal blanket, when I heard her shivering. It wasn't just a physical shake. It was a rhythmic clicking sound, the way Aurelian bones vibrate when their core temperature hits the danger zone. I stood up and walked over to her bunk. She was curled into a ball, her skin a dull, ashy gray. "Dr. Veen," I said, my voice muffled by my suit's internal comms. "You're going into hypothermic shock. I am fine," she managed to stutter, though her teeth were chattering so hard I could barely understand her. "I am used to the cold." "You're a scientist," I said, my tone flat. "Act like one. The laws of thermodynamics don't care about your pride. We have one functioning emergency thermal unit. It covers 3 square meters. If we stay in separate bunks, we both freeze by dawn." She looked at me then, her amber eyes wide. The logic was undeniable, but the social barrier was a kilometer high. To an Aurelian, physical proximity was a sacred thing, usually reserved for family or hive bonds. To me, it was just a tactical necessity. "Move," I ordered, not giving her a choice. I dragged my mattress next to hers and rigged the thermal unit above us. We lay there fully clothed in our heavy thermal layers, separated by a thin sheet and several light years of social awkwardness. Is this what humans call sharing a foxhole?" she asked after a long, tense silence. "Something like that," I grunted. "Except usually there's more mud and people are trying to kill you." "They are trying to kill me, Soren," she whispered. "Not tonight," I said. "Tonight, it's just the cold. Sleep." I stayed awake for hours, listening to the wind howl against the hull. I was hyper-aware of her presence, the way she smelled like damp earth and ozone, the way her long ears twitched in her sleep. For 5 years I had slept alone in ships, in barracks, in trenches. I had forgotten what it felt like to have another heartbeat in the room. It was terrifying. The next morning the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of 2 strangers, but the silence of 2 people who had survived a minor skirmish together. She had made tea, the real kind, with dried leaves she had smuggled from her home world. She handed me a mug without a word. It was hot, sweet, and tasted like something I had lost a long time ago. "Thank you," I said, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. "You like 3 sugars," she noted, her skin flickering a pale, shy yellow. "I watched you yesterday. You take your rations with 3 sugars when you think I am not looking." I didn't have an answer for that. I just drank the tea. As the weeks turned into months, the routine solidified. Every morning at 0600, she would brew the tea. Every evening at 1800, I would secure the airlocks and we would settle into the shared warmth of the bunks. We didn't talk about it. We didn't discuss the fact that her hand would occasionally find mine in the dark, or that I had started instinctively shielding her body with mine whenever the station groaned under a particularly heavy gust of wind. It was a slow erosion of boundaries, an inch here, a centimeter there. I remember one afternoon about 6 weeks in, when she was cataloging a new species of crystal moss. She was humming a melody, low, mournful, and incredibly complex. "What's the song?" I asked, not looking up from my carbine maintenance. "It is a song for the soil," she said, her voice distant. "In my world, we believe that plants cannot grow if they do not feel loved. We sing to the gardens to tell them that they are needed." I snorted. "Plants don't have ears, Alara." "No," she said, turning to face me. "But they have resonance. Everything has a frequency at which it feels safe, Soren. Even you. You are just tuned to a very jagged one. I didn't have a comeback for that." She was right. I was a jagged man in a jagged world. But now, standing in the wreckage of the lab in Chapter 1, watching her pack the samples that had cost us our peace, I realized the frequency had changed. The jagged edges were still there, but they were being smoothed over by something I couldn't quite define. "Soren?" Alara called out, breaking my reverie. "I have the primary cultures. The data is wiped from the station's mainframe." "Good," I said, shaking off the memories. "Strap on your rebreather. The storm outside is a Category 3. Visibility is less than 50 meters." I grabbed my pack and slung the pulse carbine over my shoulder. I looked at the small room one last time. The tea mugs were still on the table. The bunks were unmade. It had been the closest thing to a home I'd had in a decade, and now we were leaving it behind to become ghosts again. "Let's go," I said, taking her hand. "And Alara?" "Yes. Don't stop singing to those plants. We're going to need all the resonance we can get." She squeezed my hand, her skin glowing a fierce, defiant gold. I lead the way into the airlock, and as the outer door opened to the screaming void of Krios Prime, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't just protecting a scientist anymore. I was protecting the only thing that made the universe feel like it wasn't empty. The wind hit us like a physical blow, a wall of ice and darkness. I braced myself, digging my boots into the permafrost, and pulled her close. 3 kilometers, 2,300 meters to the ghost light. In this weather, it might as well have been across the galaxy. But we moved, one step, then another, together. The wind didn't just blow on Krios Prime, it screamed like a dying god. It was a physical force, a wall of frozen nitrogen and pulverized silica that sought out every microscopic seam in my tactical suit. I kept my left hand locked onto Alara's wrist, my fingers digging into the reinforced fabric of her sleeve. If I let go, the whiteout would swallow her in 3 seconds. My head-up display was a chaotic mess of flickering red warnings and topographical static. The proximity sensors were useless, drowned out by the sheer density of the storm. "Eyes on my heels, Alara," I yelled over the localized comms, my voice competing with the roar of the gale. "Don't look at the horizon. There isn't one. I can't see the markers," she cried back. Her voice was thin, vibrating with that frantic Aurelian frequency I'd come to recognize as the prelude to a total sensory collapse. "The cold it's singing in my bones, Soren." I adjusted my stance, leaning into a 60-kilometer-per-hour gust that threatened to upend us both. "Forget the markers. Trust the tether. We're halfway to the ridge." In reality, I had no idea if we were halfway. My internal navigation was slave to a dead reckoning algorithm that was currently fighting a losing battle against the magnetic interference from the moon's iron core. Every step was a gamble. My wounded shoulder was a pulsing knot of agony, the cold turning the blood-soaked bandages into a stiff, frozen plate that ground against my collarbone with every movement. "We're almost Oscar Mike to the extraction point," I lied, using the old military shorthand for "on the move." "Just keep your boots heavy and your head down." We crested a jagged spine of obsidian rock, the wind here so fierce it felt like it was trying to peel the armor plates right off my chest. Below us, nestled in a natural trench carved by ancient glaciers, sat the ghost light. From this distance, she looked like a scrap heap, a scarred, asymmetrical lump of charcoal gray alloy half buried in the snow. But to me, she was a palace. She was a Block 4 long-range interceptor, stripped of her heavy ordnance to make room for illegal sensor ghosting and high-output engines. The hatch was frosted over, a thick crust of methane ice sealing the seams. I reached for my thermal torch, my fingers fumbling with the ignition in the sub-zero gloom. "Move to the lee side," I shouted, gesturing toward the ship's landing strut. "Get out of the direct line." I triggered the torch. A concentrated needle of blue flame hissed into life, carving through the ice with a frantic urgency. My HUD flared a warning. External temp. Negative 140 degrees Celsius. We were officially in the kill zone. If the airlock didn't cycle in the next 2 minutes, our lung tissue would start to crystallize even through the rebreathers. The ice cracked. I slammed my fist against the emergency override, and the hatch groaned, internal hydraulics screaming in protest as they fought the cold. Slowly, agonizingly, the metal maw opened. I grabbed Alara by the utility harness and practically threw her inside, scrambling in behind her as the hatch hissed shut. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of an artificial environment. The air was stale, smelling of ozone, stale coffee, and the faint coppery tang of my own blood. "Cyclic checks," I panted, ripping my helmet off and letting it clatter to the deck. I leaned against the bulkhead, my chest heaving, watching the red frost on my armor begin to melt and drip onto the grating. Ilara? She was on her knees, her helmet already tossed aside. Her long, elegant ears were pressed flat against her skull, and her skin was a chaotic mosaic of bruised violets and sickly grays. She was gasping for air, her hands clutching the transport case as if it were a life preserver. "Safe," she whispered, the word barely audible. We are inside." "For now," I said, pushing off the wall. The effort sent a fresh spike of pain through my shoulder, and I hissed through my teeth. "I need to run a full diagnostic on the jump drives. If the Directorate followed us to the ridge, they'll have orbital eyes on this sector by 0200 hours. I started toward the cockpit, but her voice stopped me. It wasn't the voice of a frightened refugee anymore. It was sharp, cold, and heavy with a weight I hadn't expected. They didn't just follow me because of the political fallout on Ethelgard, Soren. I paused at the bulkhead, my hand hovering over the door seal. I didn't turn around. I knew that tone. It was the tone of a secret that had finally become too heavy to carry. "Go on," I said, my voice low. "The mycelium, the samples in this case," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "They aren't just for atmospheric scrubbing. The Directorate's botanists found a way to bridge the quantum resonance of the fungi with the human neural cortex." I finally turned to look at her. She was sitting on the deck, the case open in front of her. Inside, 3 canisters of translucent blue sludge pulsed with a rhythmic, ghostly light. "A bridge?" I asked, my brow furrowed. "You mean like a data link?" "No," she said, looking up at me, her eyes dark with a profound grief. "I mean a weapon. If you introduce these spores into a planetary ecosystem and use a cortex bridge to synchronize the resonance, you don't just scrub the air. You can command the biomass. You can turn a forest into a localized immune system that attacks anything with a foreign DNA signature. You can make the very ground beneath an army's feet dissolve into toxic sludge." I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather outside. I had seen plenty of horrors in the corporate wars. Nanite swarms that disassembled cities, orbital lances that turned oceans to steam. But this was different. This was the corruption of life itself. My world. "Ethelgard," she continued, her skin pulsing a deep, mournful blue. "They didn't blame me for an accident, Soren. They blamed me for refusing to complete the weaponization phase. They burned the southern forest to test the containment protocols, and when I tried to leak the data to the Interstellar Oversight Committee, they framed me for the very disaster they created. They called me a bioterrorist to ensure that no one would ever listen to the truth." I walked back to her, my boots heavy on the metal floor. I knelt down, ignoring the protest of my wounded shoulder, and looked at the glowing sludge. "So this isn't just about survival," I said. "This is the only evidence of what they did." "Yes," she whispered, "and the only way to reverse the damage. The gen sequence in these samples contains the kill switch for the weaponized strain. Without this, the southern forests of Ethelgard will remain a dead zone for 1,000 years." I leaned back, my head thumping against the cold alloy of a storage locker. I had spent 15 years following orders that I knew were morally foobar, fouled up beyond all recognition. I'd burned villages to protect mining rights and silence whistleblowers because the brass said they were threats to stability. I had told myself it was just a job, that the credits were the only thing that mattered because people were temporary and gold was forever. But looking at Ilara Veen, a woman who had lost her world, her reputation, and her soul just to keep a handful of spores out of the hands of monsters, I felt a strange, uncomfortable stirring in my chest. "You should have told me," I said. "Would you have stayed?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "If you knew that the most powerful corporation in the sector would never stop hunting you? If you knew that this contract was a death sentence?" I looked away, my eyes landing on the scarred metal of the ship's hull. I thought about my old team, the Shadow Walkers. We had been the best, until a mission on Velonis Prime went sideways because our handler decided we were redundant. I was the only one who made it to the extraction craft. I had spent 5 years running from that memory, convincing myself that the only way to stay safe was to stay unattached. "I didn't stay for the contract, Ilara," I said, my voice a rough growl. I told you that back at the outpost. Then why? Because, I said, looking her in the eye, I'm tired of being on the side that burns things down. She reached out then, her fingers, slim, elegant, and glowing with a soft, appreciative yellow, brushing against my armored forearm. For a moment, the ship's hum seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of our breathing. We have 4 hours before the window for a slip space jump opens, I said, breaking the moment with practiced efficiency. I need to patch this shoulder before it goes septic, and you need to get some rack time. We're going to be pulling high G maneuvers once we hit the atmosphere. Soren, she said as I stood up. Yeah? Thank you for being the person who stays. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just headed for the medical locker, my mind already calculating trajectories, fuel loads, and the 1,000 different ways we were likely to die before the night was over. But for the first time in 5 years, the math didn't fill me with dread. It felt like a challenge. The medical bay of the Ghost Light was actually just a fold-down table in the corner of the engineering room, surrounded by humming coolant lines and the rhythmic thud of the life support scrubbers. I sat on the edge of the table, my tactical suit peeled down to my waist. The wound was ugly. The Directorate Operative's round had caught the edge of my shoulder plate, shattering the ceramic and driving fragments into the muscle. The cold had kept the bleeding in check, but now that the ship's heaters were cranking at 22 degrees Celsius, the wound was weeping a dark, sluggish red. You're making a mess of my floor, Alara said, stepping into the room. She had changed out of her heavy thermal coat into a simple charcoal gray flight suit that clung to her slim frame. She was carrying a tray of medical supplies and a bowl of warm water. It's my ship, I grunted, wincing as I tried to rotate the arm. I'm allowed to bleed on it. A typical human response, she said, her voice carrying a hint of a smile. Always claiming ownership of things you cannot control. Sit still. Your physiology is ridiculously prone to infection. She moved into my space, her presence immediately changing the atmosphere of the cramped room. Aurelians don't just occupy space, they radiate it. I could feel the faint warmth coming off her skin, a biothermal hum that seemed to settle the jagged edges of my nerves. She began to clean the wound, her movements precise and incredibly gentle. Her fingers were cool against my skin, but where she touched me, a soft golden light pulsed beneath her translucent flesh. It was a strange sensation, not just physical contact, but a kind of biological recognition. This is going to sting, she warned, picking up a pair of surgical tweezers. I've had worse, I repeated my mantra, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. You say that every time you are in pain, Soren Voss. Is it a mantra to convince yourself that you are indestructible, or a reminder of all the times you were broken? I didn't answer. I just gritted my teeth as she began to extract the ceramic shards. The pain was sharp and white-hot, but I focused on the sound of her breathing, the steady rhythm of it acting as an anchor in the storm of agony. You were a soldier, she said, her voice conversational, as if she weren't currently pulling shrapnel out of my meat. For a long time. 12 years in the Directorate Shock Corps, I said, my voice strained. 3 years as a ghost asset. I've seen every sector from here to the Corps. And your family? Gone, I said shortly. Earth is a graveyard of corporate interests. My parents died in the great subsidence of the North American sector when I was 10. I was raised in a state-run military academy. The Corps was my family until it wasn't. She paused, the tweezers holding a bloody sliver of armor. Her eyes met mine, and I saw a reflection of my own isolation there. We are not so different then, she whispered. My family. They were the ones who turned me in. My brother is a high-ranking official in the Sanguine Directorate. He signed the warrant for my re-education. I looked at her, truly stunned. I'd seen a lot of betrayals, contracts broken, backstabbing handlers, sold-out teammates. But the idea of your own blood handing you over to the wolves was a level of darkness I hadn't expected from her. Why? I asked. Because he believes in the order, she said, her skin pulsing a dull, bitter violet. He believes that the survival of our species depends on the power of the Directorate. He thinks I am a dreamer who would let us all starve for the sake of a moral victory. He doesn't understand that once you sacrifice your soul for survival, there is nothing left worth surviving for. She finished cleaning the wound and applied a layer of biofoam. The cooling sensation was immediate, a numbing relief that made my head light. She then began to wrap the shoulder in a clean compression bandage, her face just inches from mine. "There," she said, tying off the knot. "You will live, though I suspect you will find something else to bleed for before the week is out." I looked at her, my gaze lingering on the delicate curve of her ears and the intricate patterns of her bioluminescent veins. In the dim light of the engineering room, she looked like something out of a myth, a creature of light trapped in a world of iron and grease. "Why do you do it, Alara?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you keep fighting for a world that threw you away?" "Because I remember the gardens," she said, her eyes softening. "I remember the way the air tasted after a rainfall in the southern forests. I remember the sound of the children laughing in the bioluminescent groves. That world is still there, Soren. It's just buried under layers of greed and fear. If I give up, then the fear wins. And I refuse to let the fear be the last thing I feel." She reached out, her hand hovering just an inch from my cheek. I didn't pull away. I didn't move. The air between us was thick with a tension that felt more dangerous than the storm outside. "You have a garden too, Soren," she said. "You just keep it behind so many walls that you've forgotten where the entrance is." I reached up, my scarred hand covering hers, pressing her palm against my face. Her skin was soft, smelling of those strange blue fungi and the cold vacuum of space. It was the first time I had initiated contact, the first time I had let someone pass the zero-contact perimeter I'd spent 5 years perfecting. "There's nothing behind those walls but rubble, Alara," I said. "Then we will use the rubble to build something new," she replied. I leaned forward, my forehead resting against hers. It was a gesture of trust I didn't even know I was capable of. For a long moment, we just stayed like that. Two refugees from different worlds, huddling together in the belly of a dying ship. The ghost light groaned as a fresh gust of wind battered the hull. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was fighting the universe alone. "We need to get to the cockpit," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "The storm is peaking. If we don't jump now, the atmospheric pressure will pin us to the surface." "Go," she said, stepping back and giving me a small, encouraging smile. "I will secure the mycelium. I will be right behind you." I stood up, the biofoam already working its magic on my shoulder. I felt lighter, and it wasn't just the painkillers. I headed for the cockpit, my boots striking the floor with a new sense of purpose. I climbed into the pilot's seat, my hands moving over the familiar controls with a fluid, unconscious grace. I toggled the pre-flight sequence, watching the holographic displays bloom into life. Engine core, 98%. Life support, stable. Weapon systems, offline. I didn't need the guns, I needed the speed. Alara slid into the co-pilot's seat beside me, her hands moving over the sensor arrays. Her skin was glowing a steady, hopeful amber. "Thermal signatures detected in upper orbit," she reported, her voice steady. "2 Directorate frigates. They're launching atmospheric interceptors." "Estimated time to intercept?" I asked, my fingers dancing over the jump drive calculations. 12 minutes, she said. I looked at her, a wolfish grin spreading across my face. "Then we better make this quick." I don't like to keep the brass waiting. I gripped the flight sticks, feeling the ship's engines thrumming beneath me like a living thing. I could feel Alara watching me, her presence a warm, steady hum at the edge of my awareness. "Hang on," I said, toggling the manual thrusters. "It's about to get a little bumpy." I slammed the throttles forward. The ghost light screamed as she tore herself free from the ice, the landing struts groaning as they retracted into the hull. We surged upward, a needle of fire piercing the heart of the storm. Behind us, Krios Prime shrank into a white, swirling marble of ice and regret. Ahead, the black void of space waited, filled with 1,000 dangers and a single, flickering hope. As we cleared the atmosphere and the stars burst into view, I felt Alara's hand find mine on the console. I didn't pull away. I gripped her fingers, feeling the golden light of her skin seep into my own. "We're out," she whispered, watching the stars. "We're just getting started," I corrected her. I engaged the slip space drive. The universe blurred, the stars stretching into long, white ribbons of light. We plunged into the void, leaving behind the world that had tried to kill us heading toward a future that we would have to build with our own scarred hands. And as the ship settled into the rhythmic hum of faster-than-light travel, I realized that for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't running away from something. I was running toward it. I looked at Alara, her face illuminated by the soft blue light of the jump tunnel. She looked like a miracle. And as I closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion finally take hold, I knew that whatever happened next, I wouldn't be doing it alone. The geometry of my loneliness had finally been broken, and in its place, something new was beginning to grow. Something that felt dangerously, beautifully like home. Slip space was never truly silent. To the uninitiated, it felt like a void of white noise. But to a man who had spent 15 years listening to the hum of a reactor core, it was a symphony of groans, clicks, and the haunting whistle of the quantum field stabilizers. We were 3 days into the jump toward the neutral territories, suspended in that strange, shimmering non-place where time felt like a suggestion rather than a rule. I stood in the center of the cargo bay, the floor plated in reinforced industrial steel that had seen better decades. I'd cleared away the spare fuel canisters and tether lines to create a makeshift combat ring. Across from me, Ilara stood with her feet too close together, her shoulders hunched, looking more like a frightened student than a revolutionary with a galaxy-altering secret. "Keep your chin tucked," I said, my voice echoing in the hollow space. "If you leave it out there like a target, a directorate ghost will take it off your neck before you even see the flash of the blade." "I am a scientist, Soren," she replied, her skin pulsing a weary, frustrated violet. "I do not understand why I must learn to break bones when my hands were made to heal ecosystems." I moved toward her, my footsteps slow and predatory, because the people who want what's in that case don't care about what your hands were made for. They only care about what they can take from them. In this sector, doctor is just another word for unarmed casualty. Now stay frosty. Watch my eyes, not my hands. I lunged. It was a slow-motion strike, a telegraph jab meant to test her reflexes. She flinched, closing her eyes and turning her head away. I stopped my fist 2 inches from her temple. "Dead," I said flatly. "You just bought yourself a one-way ticket to the morgue." "Open your eyes, Ilara. You can't negotiate with a bullet, and you certainly can't hide from it by blinking." She snapped her eyes open, her ears pinned back in a sharp display of Aurelian anger. "You are being unnecessarily cruel." "The universe is cruel," I countered, stepping back into a defensive stance. "I'm just being honest. If we get boarded, I can't be in 2 places at once. I can't watch my 6 and yours simultaneously. You need to be able to buy yourself 10 seconds. 10 seconds is the difference between me finding you alive or finding you KIA. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Her skin shifted from violet to a determined, albeit pale yellow. "Fine. Again." We went again. And again. For 3 hours, I pushed her. I taught her the dirty basics. How to use a thumb to find an eye socket. How to drive a knee into a groin. How to break a grip by targeting the smallest finger. It wasn't the elegant martial arts they taught in the academies. It was the raw, brutal survivalism of the trenches. By the end of the session, she was covered in sweat, her charcoal flight suit sticking to her frame. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving, but her eyes were steady. She had stopped flinching. "Better," I said, tossing her a towel. "You're starting to move like someone who wants to keep breathing." She wiped her face, her gaze lingering on the scars that crisscrossed my forearms, reminders of the wars that had stripped me of everything but the ability to kill. "Why did you really join the shock corps, Soren? You talk about it like it was a prison, but you wear the skills like a second skin." I walked over to a stack of crates and sat down, the metal cold against my legs. I didn't want to talk about it. I wanted to go to the cockpit and stare at the sensor ghosts until my eyes bled. But she was looking at me with that Aurelian empathy, her skin glowing with a soft, inquisitive amber that seemed to peel back my layers before I could even tighten them. "I was 19, I said, my voice low. I lived in a sub-level tenement in the Seattle sector. My parents were gone, and my sister was sick with respiratory failure because the corporations had stopped paying for the atmospheric scrubbers in the low-yield zones. The recruiters came through with promises of medical credits and a path to citizenship. I signed the line because I thought I could save her. Did you? I laughed, a harsh, dry sound that had no humor in it. I spent 3 years on the front lines in the Martian colonies, sending every credit back home. Then I got a notification while I was in a foxhole on Velonis Prime. She had died 2 months prior. The directorate had redirected my credits to cover my own training fees and equipment insurance. I had been fighting for a ghost while the people I worked for stole her life support. Soren, I didn't stop. I couldn't. It was like a dam had cracked. I became a shadow walker because I wanted to be the monster the directorate feared. I thought if I climbed high enough, I could burn the system down from the inside. But the system is a machine, Alara. You don't burn it. It just uses your fire to power its engines. My whole team, 7 good men and women, they were sacrificed on a black op just to cover up a clerical error in a shipping manifest. I realized then that in their eyes, we weren't even people. We were just assets, depreciating assets. She moved toward me, her footsteps silent on the steel deck. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat down on the crate next to me, her shoulder brushing mine. The warmth of her skin was a sharp contrast to the coldness of the memory. "Is that why you won't let anyone close?" she asked softly. "Because you're afraid they'll become assets too?" I looked at my hands, the knuckles bruised from the day's training. "If you don't have anyone to lose, you don't have any weaknesses," I said, though even to my own ears it sounded like a hollow lie. "That's the first rule of survival in the void." "It is a lonely rule, Soren," she said, "and it is factually incorrect. In nature, the species that survive aren't the ones that isolate. They are the ones that form symbiotic bonds. The mycelium doesn't grow in a vacuum. It connects everything in the forest so that when one tree is sick, the others can send it nutrients. Survival is an act of community, not a solo performance." "Community gets people killed," I snapped, standing up. "It makes you soft. It makes you hesitate when you should be pulling the trigger." I started to walk away, but she caught my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her skin pulsing a fierce, brilliant gold. "You didn't hesitate when the directorate operatives were at the door of the lab," she said. "You didn't hesitate when you pulled me through that storm. You think you're a machine, Soren Voss, but your heart is louder than your armor. You stayed because you chose to care. Don't punish yourself for that." I pulled my hand away, but not as quickly as I should have. "I'll be in the cockpit," I said, my voice thick. "Get some rest, Doc. We jump into the Nexus belt in 6 hours. It's a high-traffic zone. We need to be ready for anything." I fled the cargo bay, the heavy thud of my boots echoing like a heartbeat against the metal. I had spent 5 years convinced that I was a dead man walking, a ghost in a suit of armor. But as I sat in the pilot's chair and stared into the swirling white noise of slip space, I realized that the walls I had built around myself weren't just keeping people out. They were keeping me trapped in the dark. And Alara Veen, with her glowing skin and her songs for the soil, was starting to let the light in. It was the most dangerous thing I had ever encountered. The Nexus belt was a chaotic sprawl of frozen rock, discarded hull plating, and the shimmering dust of ancient collisions. It was a haven for smugglers, independent miners, and people who didn't want their transponders tracked by the major conglomerates. It was also the primary gateway to the neutral territories, the place where we could finally disappear for good. The ghost light hummed as she navigated the asteroid field, her lateral thrusters firing in short, precise bursts. I was at the helm, my eyes darting between the short-range lidar and the long-range thermal scanner. "Keep the cloak at 40%, I told Alara, who was monitoring the electronic countermeasures. "We don't want to look like a stealth ship. We just want to look like a freighter with a faulty sensor array." "Low profile is the name of the game." "Copy that," she said, her hands moving with a newfound confidence over the console. Her skin was a steady, calm amber. "Signal-to-noise ratio is within acceptable limits. We're just another piece of space junk in the pipe." I nodded, starting to relax just a fraction. We were only 12 hours away from the jump gate. Once we were through, the directorate's jurisdiction ended. We could find a garden world, hide the mycelium, and maybe, just maybe, figure out what a life without a contract looked like. Then the console chirped. It was a low, persistent sound, a frequency that didn't belong in the Nexus belt. Sit rep, I barked, my hands tightening on the flight sticks. Alara's brow furrowed. I'm picking up a localized burst transmission. It's coming from inside the ship. I felt a cold spike of adrenaline. A beacon? I don't know, she said, her skin beginning to pulse a frantic violet. It's encrypted with a high-level Aurelian cipher. It's, oh no. What? It's the private frequency of the Veen family estate, she whispered, her hands shaking. It's my brother's signature. I didn't think. I reacted. I engaged the autopilot and vaulted over the console, heading straight for the cargo bay, where the mycelium case was stored. Ilara scrambled after me, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I slammed the release on the case. The canisters of blue sludge were there, pulsing with their rhythmic light. But beneath the secondary foam lining, a small silver disc was blinking, a subquantum comms relay. You reached out to him, I said, my voice like ice. I turned to look at her, the betrayal burning in my throat like acid. You sent a packet while we were at Outpost 9. Soren, please, she cried, her skin a chaotic mess of bruised colors. I had to. He is my brother. I thought if I could just explain, if I could show him the data on the kill switch, he would realize what the directorate was doing. I thought family meant something. I grabbed the disc and crushed it in my gloved hand, the electronics sparking and dying. Family is just a vulnerability people use to find you, Ilara. I told you that. I spent 3 months keeping you alive, and you just handed them a breadcrumb trail straight to our front door. I didn't tell them where we were going. It doesn't matter what you told them, I yelled, the sound echoing in the small cargo bay. A subquantum relay tracks the origin point of the transmission. They don't need a map if they have your coordinates. I shoved past her, heading back to the cockpit. My mind was racing, calculating the variables. We were in the middle of a debris field, our cloak was at 40%, and we just lit a flare in the middle of a dark room. Soren, wait. She caught my arm, her eyes filled with tears. I was trying to save my world. I couldn't let it die without trying to reach the one person I thought still loved me. Loving someone doesn't change the laws of tactical reality, I growled, shaking her off. You're not a scientist right now, Ilara. You're an accidental informant. I hit the pilot's seat and slammed the long-range scanners to maximum power. For 5 seconds, the screen was blank. Then 2 massive thermal blooms appeared at the edge of the Nexus belt. Frigates, I said, the word a death sentence. Directorate heavy hitters. They didn't send a scouting party this time. They sent the executioners. And they weren't alone. A dozen smaller signatures, interceptors, were already peeling off from the frigates, moving in a high-speed pincer movement designed to trap us against the largest asteroid in the sector. They're blocking the jump gate, Ilara said, her voice small and hollow. We're boxed in. I looked at the tactical display. We were outgunned, outnumbered, and trapped in a debris field that was slowly becoming a graveyard. My shoulder throbbed, a reminder of the last time I'd tried to be a hero. I looked at Ilara. She was huddled in the co-pilot's seat, her ears drooping, her skin a dull, lifeless gray. She looked like she had already given up. The cost of her hope, the cost of her refusal to let go of her brother, was about to be our lives. I should have felt anger. I should have felt the cold, clinical detachment of a contractor who had just been burned. But as I looked at her, I didn't see an asset or an informant. I saw a woman who was so desperate for connection that she had risked everything for a lie. I saw myself 10 years ago signing a contract to save a sister who was already gone. We aren't going to the gate, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. She looked at me, her amber eyes wide. Where are we going? Into the maw, I said, pointing to a massive, swirling vortex of dust and ionized gas at the center of the belt. A gravitational anomaly that most pilots avoided like the plague. We'll be crushed, she whispered. Maybe, I said, engaging the manual overrides. But the directorate frigates are too big to follow us in. If we can navigate the gravity wells, we can slingshot out the other side and hit the secondary jump point in Sector 7. It's a suicide run, Soren. I gripped the flight sticks, my knuckles turning white. Life is a suicide run, Doc. The only difference is how you handle the controls. Now strap in. And Alara? She looked at me, a flicker of hope returning to her skin. Next time you want to call your brother, use a burner phone. I slammed the throttles to the firewall. The ghost light screamed as she dove toward the heart of the anomaly. Behind us, the Directorate interceptors opened fire, their pulse cannons lighting up the darkness like malevolent stars. The ship buckled as we hit the first gravity shear. The internal lights flickered, and the groan of the hull was so loud it sounded like the ship was screaming. I fought the controls, my muscles straining against the sheer force of the acceleration. "We're losing the stabilizers," Alara yelled over the roar of the engines. "The gravity is pulling us into the core. Divert power from the life support to the lateral thrusters," I commanded. "But we won't be able to breathe. We won't need to breathe if we're a smear on an asteroid." "Just do it." She hesitated for a split second. Then her hands flew over the console. The lights went out, replaced by the dim red glow of the emergency power. The air grew thin and cold, but the ship responded, her thrusters firing with a violent intensity that pushed us away from the central gravity well. We were weaving through the debris now, rocks the size of cities whistling past our hull. I was flying by instinct, my mind a blur of vectors and impact probabilities. Every time an interceptor got a lock, I dove into a dust cloud or behind a spinning fragment of hull plating. It was a dance on the edge of a razor, and for a moment, in the middle of the chaos and the fear, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't fighting for a contract. I wasn't fighting for a paycheck. I was fighting for the woman beside me, the woman who had reminded me that even in the darkest void, there is something worth protecting. "We're through the first shear," Alara shouted, her skin pulsing a brilliant, desperate gold. "We're reaching the slingshot point. Engaging the jump drives on my mark," I yelled. 3, 2, 1. Mark! I slammed the jump lever. For a second, time stopped. The universe distorted, the gravity of the maw pulling at the very fabric of the ship. Then with a violent shudder that felt like it would tear the ghost light in two, we vanished. We burst back into real space on the far side of the Nexus belt, hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from the Directorate frigates. The silence that followed was absolute. I slumped back in the seat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My shoulder was screaming, and my hands were shaking so hard I had to let go of the controls. Did we make it?" Alara asked, her voice trembling. I checked the scanners. The thermal signatures of the Directorate ships were far behind us, trapped on the other side of the anomaly. They were searching the debris, but they hadn't followed us through. "We made it," I said, my voice a rasping whisper. "We're in Sector 7. They'll need hours to recalibrate their sensors to find us." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She unbuckled her harness and practically fell toward me, her arms wrapping around my neck in a fierce, desperate hug. "I'm sorry," she sobbed into my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Soren. I was so stupid. I didn't push her away this time." I sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs, and slowly, awkwardly, I put my good arm around her. "You weren't stupid, Alara," I said, my voice softening. "You were just human, or Aurelian, whatever. You wanted to believe in something better than a gun. I can't fault you for that." She pulled back, looking at me with eyes that were red-rimmed but clear. "But I almost got us killed." "We've been almost killed before," I said, reaching out to wipe a tear from her cheek. "It's becoming a habit. But listen to me. No more secrets. No more reaching out to the past. From here on out, it's just us. The Directorate, the Veen family, they're dead to us. Do you understand?" She nodded, her skin glowing a steady, somber yellow. "Just us." I looked at the stars ahead, the stars of the neutral territories. We were free for now. But as I watched the data streams on the console, I knew that the brother who had betrayed her wouldn't stop. He had the signature of the ship now. He had the trajectory. He would be coming for the mycelium, and he would be coming for his sister. The humanistic theme of trust had been tested, and it had nearly broken us. But as I looked at Alara, who was already starting to recalibrate the sensor array with a grim determination, I realized that the cost of isolation was far higher than the risk of betrayal. We had survived the maw. Now we had to survive the future. I reached out and squeezed her hand, a simple, human gesture in the cold heart of the ship. Get some tea, Doc, I said. We've got a long way to go. She smiled then, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. And for the first time since I had left Earth, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The planet beneath us was an emerald bruise in the darkness of the neutral territories. We called it the Jade Veil, a name that sounded far more poetic than the reality of a gravity-locked forest moon with an atmosphere thick enough to drown a man in his own sweat. It was a place where the canopy was 500 meters deep and the sunlight never touched the floor. It was the perfect place to hide a secret and an even better place to die. I brought the ghost light down through the upper atmosphere at a steep, punishing angle. I wasn't looking for a landing pad. I was looking for a hole in the green. "Keep the descent leveled, Soren," Alara shouted, her hands flying over the stabilizers. "We're pulling 4Gs. The structural integrity is redlining. She'll hold." I grunted, my teeth vibrating in my skull. "I've seen this bird take orbital fire and keep flying. Just watch the thermals for any signatures. If they're here, they're masked." We punched through the cloud layer, and the world turned a vibrant, suffocating green. Below us, the trees were colossal, their branches intertwined like the fingers of 1,000 giants. I flared the thrusters at 60 meters, the heat turning the humid air into a localized steam cloud. We settled into a clearing that was barely wider than the ship's wingspan, the landing strut sinking a foot into the ancient, decaying loam. I didn't wait for the dust to settle. I was out of my seat, grabbing my pulse carbine and a bandolier of thermite charges. "Stay inside until I've cleared a 50-meter perimeter," I told Alara. "If you see anything on the sensors that isn't a bird, you seal the hatch and you don't open it for anyone but me." She looked at me, her skin a pale, anxious yellow. "You think he's already here, don't you?" "Kalen Veen didn't spend 30 years in the directorate by being slow," I said, checking the charge pack on my carbine. "He's a tactical genius who knows exactly how you think. He didn't just track the signal. He predicted your destination based on the climate requirements of the mycelium. He's in the wire, Ilara. I can feel it." I hit the airlock release. The air that rushed in was heavy with the scent of jasmine, rotting vegetation, and something sharper, the metallic tang of ozone. I stepped out onto the ramp, my boots squelching in the mud. The forest was alive with sound, the rhythmic clicking of insects, the distant cry of arboreal predators, and the constant wet drip of condensation from the canopy. I moved with the silence of a man who had spent half his life in the shadows. I checked the perimeter, my HUD painting the forest in shades of blue and gray. Nothing. No heat signatures, no electronic ghosts. I was about to signal the all clear when the silence of the forest was shattered by a sound I knew all too well. The low, rhythmic thrum of a high-output grav engine. I didn't shout. I didn't panic. I just hit the deck, rolling into the cover of a massive, moss-covered root. "Alara, get down," I hissed into the comms. "We've got bogies. 2 shuttles, coming in hot from the northwest." Through the gaps in the trees, I saw them. 2 sleek, matte black Directorate dropships, their slip space cloaks shimmering as they transitioned to atmospheric flight. They weren't hiding anymore. They were coming for the prize. They landed on the far side of the clearing, their thrusters turning the lush vegetation into charred sticks. The hatches blew open, and 20 Directorate operatives poured out, moving with the synchronized precision of a hive mind. They were wearing Mark 7 tactical suits, the kind with integrated active camouflage. In this forest, they would be nearly invisible, and in the center of them stood a man who didn't look like a soldier. He was tall, dressed in a sharp, slate-gray Directorate uniform, his silver hair cropped close to his skull. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He didn't need to. He had the weight of an empire behind him. Kalen Veen. He stood in the center of the clearing, his eyes scanning the ghost light with a cold, clinical detachment. He raised a small, handheld transmitter to his lips. "Ilara." His voice echoed through the forest, amplified by the shuttle's external speakers. It was a voice of pure, unadulterated authority. "I know you are in there, and I know you have the contractor with you." I didn't move. I sighted my carbine on Kalen's chest, my finger hovering over the trigger. One shot. I could end it right here. But the operatives were already fanning out, their sensors searching for my position. If I fired, they'd turn the clearing into a kill box before the shell hit the ground. You have 10 minutes to surrender the samples, Kalen continued. If you comply, I can guarantee your safety and a full pardon. If you do not, I have orders to neutralize the vessel and everyone aboard. Do not let your misplaced sentimentality destroy what remains of our family. Inside the ship, Ilara's voice came through my earpiece, trembling and thin. Soren, what do we do? I closed my eyes for a second, feeling the damp heat of the forest pressing in on me. I thought about the 3 months we'd spent in the cold of Outpost 9. I thought about the tea with 3 sugars and the way she sang to the plants. I thought about the rubble of my own life and the way she had started to build something new out of it. We don't surrender, I said, my voice a low, dangerous rasp. We make them pay for every inch of this dirt. I triggered the remote for the ship's external defenses. 4 concealed pulse turrets popped from the Ghost Light's hull, opening fire with a deafening roar. The clearing erupted into chaos. Red bolts of energy tore through the directorate lines, sending operatives scrambling for cover. I used the distraction to move. I sprinted toward the nearest group of soldiers, my carbine spitting fire. I took the first 2 down before they could even orient their visors. I rolled, came up behind a third, and drove my vibroblade through his spine plate. Soren, they're flanking you, Ilara yelled. 3 tangos moving through the high brush on your 6. I spun, firing a burst that caught the lead operative in the throat. I dove behind a tree as a volley of return fire shredded the bark above my head. I'm pinned, I shouted. Ilara, get to the secondary cockpit. If I can draw them away from the ship, you have to punch it. Get to the jump point. No, she cried. I'm not leaving you. This isn't a negotiation, Doc. Skedaddle. Get the mycelium out of here. That's the mission. The mission is FUBAR, Soren. Her voice was suddenly hard, stripped of its fear. You told me that survival is a community act. I'm not leaving my community to die in the mud. I heard the airlock cycle. Before I could yell at her to get back inside, she stepped out onto the ramp. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She was carrying the transport case, the one with the glowing blue sludge that everyone was willing to kill for. Stop, she screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the pulse fire. The shooting didn't stop because of her command. It stopped because Kalen Veen raised his hand. The directorate operatives froze, their weapons still aimed at the ship, but their fingers held. Kalen stepped forward, his boots crunching on the charred leaves. Ilara, put the case down. No, she said, her skin pulsing a fierce, brilliant yellow. If you take one more step, I'll trigger the internal failsafe. I'll incinerate the samples and the kill switch. You'll have your weaponized strain, Kalen, but you'll never be able to control it. You'll be the king of a graveyard. Kalen paused, his eyes narrowing. You wouldn't. You love the soil too much to destroy the only thing that can save it. I love the people who stand on the soil more, she said, her gaze drifting toward where I was crouched in the shadows. You sacrificed your soul for the directorate, Kalen. I'm not letting you sacrifice mine. I saw the shift in Kalen's eyes. It wasn't regret. It was the cold, calculating logic of a man who had already decided that the cost of failure was higher than the cost of a life. He looked at his lead operative and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Sniper! I roared, lunging out from behind the tree. I didn't aim for the soldiers. I aimed for the sensor mast on the nearest shuttle, hoping to jam their comms. But I was too late. A single, high-velocity round whistled through the humid air. It didn't hit Ilara. It hit the transport case in her hands. The containment field shattered. A cloud of brilliant bioluminescent blue spores erupted into the air, swirling around Ilara like a halo of neon dust. She fell back, the broken case clattering on the ramp. No! I screamed, charging across the clearing. I didn't care about the operatives. I didn't care about Kalen. I hit the first 2 soldiers like a freight train, my shoulder plates shattering their visors. I fired my carbine until the power pack hissed and died. Then I used the weapon as a club, clearing a path to the ramp. I reached her just as she was trying to crawl back into the ship. The spores were everywhere, on her skin, in her lungs, glowing with an intensity that was blinding. Ilara! I grabbed her, pulling her into the airlock. I slammed the hatch shut, the metal booming as the directorate operatives began to pour fire into the hull. I dragged her into the center of the ship, my hands shaking as I checked her vitals. "Soren," she whispered, her eyes wide and glassy. The resonance. I can feel it." I looked at the internal sensors. The spores weren't toxic to her, not yet, but they were searching for a bridge. They were trying to synchronize with her neural cortex. If the weaponized strain was active, the spores would begin to rewrite her DNA from the inside out. "I have to get you to the med bay," I said, picking her up. "I have to flush your system." Too late, a voice echoed through the ship's internal speakers. I froze. I looked at the console. The screen was flickering, replaced by the cold, sharp face of Kalen Veen. He had hacked the ship's external comms link. "The spores have already begun the bridge sequence, Ilara," Kalen said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are now the primary host for the mycelium. You are the weapon. And since you refuse to serve the Directorate, I'm afraid you are also the evidence that must be destroyed." I saw the proximity alert on the HUD. The Directorate shuttles weren't landing anymore. They were pulling back. "Orbital strike," I whispered, the blood draining from my face. "They're going to glass the whole sector." "Soren!" Ilara grabbed my collar, her skin glowing so bright it was painful to look at. "The ship, the Ghost Light, it has a localized EMP burst in the engine core for emergency shutdowns. If I trigger it, the ship dies," I said. "We'll be trapped here. If you trigger it, it will disrupt the quantum resonance of the spores for 10 seconds, she said, her voice growing stronger, more certain. "It will break the bridge. It's the only way to get the spores out of my system before they lock in." "And the strike?" I asked. "If the resonance breaks, the Directorate will lose the lock on the mycelium signature," she said. "They'll think the samples were destroyed in the fire. They might pull back the strike to confirm. It's our only chance." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had taught me that survival was a choice, not an accident. I looked at the rubble of my life, and I realized that for the first time, I knew exactly what was worth saving. I didn't go to the med bay. I went to the engine room. I reached the core, the massive humming heart of the ship. I ripped off the safety housing, exposing the manual override for the EMP burst. "Soren!" Alara's voice came over the internal comms. "Do it now! The shuttles are clear!" I gripped the lever. I thought about the Ghost Light. I thought about the years I'd spent in her belly, the only home I'd known. I thought about the credits I'd never spend and the wars I'd never fight again. I pulled the lever. The world turned inside out. A wave of invisible energy rippled through the ship, silencing the engines, darkening the lights, and sending a bone-deep vibration through my teeth. The silence that followed was absolute. The ship was dead. We were in total darkness, miles deep in a hostile forest, with an orbital strike likely seconds away. I stumbled back to the main deck, using my tactical light to find the way. I found Alara lying on the floor. The blue glow was gone. Her skin was a pale, natural amber, and her breathing was shallow but steady. I knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was there, strong and rhythmic. "We broke the bridge," I whispered. She opened her eyes and looked at me. She reached out, her hand finding mine in the dark. "We're still alive," she said. "For now," I replied. I looked up at the viewport. The sky above the Jade Veil was silent. No pillars of fire, no orbital lances. Kalen Veen had seen the signature vanish. He thought he had won. He thought the weapon was gone. I sat there in the dark, holding her hand, listening to the forest breathe around us. We had no ship. We had no research. We had no credits. We were two refugees on a moon that didn't know we existed. "We lost everything," I said. "No," she said, pulling me closer. "We just cleared the rubble." And as the first light of dawn began to filter through the 500-meter canopy, I realized she was right. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't a soldier, a ghost, or an asset. I was just a man, standing beside the person he chose to stay with. And that was more than enough. The 3 days following the crash were a blur of humid heat, physical exhaustion, and a quiet, profound kind of peace. We had stripped the Ghost Light of everything useful: emergency rations, medical kits, the long-range survival tent, and my remaining ammunition. The ship itself was a hollow shell, a monument to a life I was no longer living. We had moved 2 kilometers into the forest, setting up camp in a natural cave behind a waterfall. The sound of the water was a constant, soothing roar that masked our voices and provided a natural barrier against the heat trackers of any directorate drones that might still be buzzing in the upper atmosphere. I stood by the edge of the water, sharpening my vibroblade with a manual whetstone. It was a rhythmic, meditative task. My shoulder was still stiff, the biofoam having done its job, but leaving behind a thick, itchy scar. "Soren?" Alara called out from inside the cave. "The tea is ready." I set the blade down and walked back into our makeshift home. The survival tent was pitched in the center of the cave, its internal heaters keeping the dampness at bay. Alara was sitting on a crate, 2 steaming mugs in her hands. She looked different. The frantic, nervous light that had always flickered in her skin was gone, replaced by a steady, calm radiance. "You're thinking about the jump point," she said, handing me a mug. "I'm thinking about how we're going to get off this rock without a ship," I said, taking a sip. The tea was bitter, local leaves that she'd found in the undergrowth, but it was hot. "We have the emergency beacon from the Ghost Light's escape pod," she reminded me. "If we can get it to the high ridge, we can signal a neutral freighter. It will take time, but we will get out." I nodded, looking at the flickering light of the portable stove. "Kalen won't stop looking, Alara. He'll send scouts. He'll check the wreckage." "Let him," she said, her voice hard. "He saw the mycelium signature vanish. He thinks the research is gone. In his mind, I am either dead or a powerless refugee. He has no reason to burn the whole moon for a ghost." I looked at her, truly amazed by her resilience. "You lost your life's work, Alara. The samples, the data, the kill switch, everything you fought for." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the steam rise from her mug. I thought so too at first. I felt a hole in my chest where the forest used to be. But then I realized something when the bridge broke. "What? The mycelium? It isn't just in the canisters, Soren. It's a quantum organism. It doesn't just exist in the sludge. It exists in the resonance. When I was the host, even for those few seconds, I didn't just feel the weapon, I felt the map." I frowned. "What map?" "The genetic sequence for the recovery strain," she said, her eyes bright with a sudden, fierce hope. "It's etched into my neural pathways. I can't explain it in human terms, but it's like a song I can't stop hearing. I don't need the canisters. I am the research now." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's damp air. "You're saying we can still save Ethelgard?" "I'm saying we can save more than that," she said. "We can teach others how to listen to the soil. We can build a new kind of botany, one that isn't based on extraction and control, but on connection. But it will take years. It will mean living in the shadows, moving from world to world, never staying anywhere long enough to be caught." She looked at me, her amber eyes searching mine. "It's not the life I would have chosen for you, Soren. You've already spent 5 years running. I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to take your share of the rations and find your own way." I set my mug down on the crate. I stood up and walked over to the cave entrance, looking out at the emerald wilderness of the Jade Vale. I thought about the military academies, the foxholes on Valonis Prime, the coal bunk at Outpost 9. I thought about the man I used to be, a man who thought that home was a coordinate on a map and that safety was a loaded gun. I turned back to her. "My whole life, I've been looking for an extraction point," I said. "I thought if I could just get far enough away, I'd finally be free. But the further I ran, the smaller I felt." I walked back to her and knelt down, taking her hands in mine. Her skin was warm, the golden light of her veins pulsing in time with my own heartbeat. "Home isn't a planet, Alara," I said, my voice thick with the realization I had been running from for years. "And it sure as hell isn't a ship." She smiled, her eyes filling with tears. "Then what is it?" "It's the person who stays when they don't have to," I said. "It's the 3 sugars in the tea. It's the song you sing to the plants. It's you." I reached out and touched her face, my thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I'm done running, Doc. If we're going to be shadows, then we'll be shadows together. I don't care about the credits or the contract. I just care about making sure you're there when I wake up in the morning." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then she was in my arms. We stayed like that for a long time, held together by nothing but our own choice. Outside, the waterfall continued its roar, a silver curtain protecting us from a universe that was still cold, still dangerous, and still hunting for us. But inside the cave, for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. We spent the afternoon preparing for the hike to the high ridge. It would be a grueling climb through the upper canopy levels, but it was our only chance to reach the signal point. We moved with a new kind of efficiency, not the efficiency of a soldier and his charge, but the efficiency of a team. As the twin suns of the Jade Veil began to set, casting long purple shadows across the forest floor, Ilara stopped at the edge of the clearing. She knelt down and pressed her hand into the damp earth, her skin glowing a soft, rhythmic yellow. "What are you doing?" I asked, adjusting the straps of my pack. "Saying goodbye," she said, "and thank you." "To the forest?" "To the life we left behind," she said, standing up. "It was a good life, Soren, but I think I like this one better." I looked at her, standing there in her battered flight suit, her hair tangled and her face smeared with mud. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Me too," I said. I checked my carbine one last time, then reached out and took her hand. We stepped out of the cave and into the green, heading toward the high ridge in the uncertain future that waited beyond the stars. The path was steep, the air was thick, and the tangos were still out there somewhere in the dark. But as we climbed, I realized that the weight I had been carrying for 15 years, the weight of my guilt, my isolation, and my fear, was gone. I was a man with a purpose. I was a man with a home. And as we reached the first canopy level and the stars began to peek through the leaves, I knew that no matter how far we had to go, we were already exactly where we needed to be. The climb to the high ridge of the Jade Veil was not a journey. It was an exercise in systematic suffering. For 3 days, we carved our way through the vertical labyrinth of the forest, moving from the rotting floor to the middle canopy, where the air was a literal soup of humidity and predatory spores. My tactical suit was dead, 100 kilograms of expensive alloy and fiber optics that were now nothing more than a glorified weight vest. I had stripped the power cells to keep the emergency beacon primed, leaving me to fight the terrain with nothing but raw muscle and a stubborn refusal to let the forest win. "Check your 6, Ilara," I grunted, grabbing a thick, rope-like vine and hauling myself up onto a moss-covered branch the size of a city bus. The ground was now 200 meters below us, hidden by a sea of shifting green shadows. "Copy that," she said, her voice strained but steady. She was right behind me, her skin pulsing a dim, focused yellow. She had discarded her laboratory sensibilities somewhere between the crash and the first kilometer of vertical ascent. She moved with a desperate, wiry grace, her hands stained with the sap of a dozen different alien trees. We reached a plateau where the canopy thinned, allowing the first real glimpse of the sky we had seen since the ghost light became a tomb. The twin suns were low on the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of violent orange and bruised gold. "How are the vitals?" I asked, dropping my pack and collapsing against the bole of a tree that felt as solid as a mountain. "Stable," she said, sitting beside me and opening our last packet of emergency rations. "The resonance is quiet. The mycelium has settled into the subdermal layers. It is peaceful, Soren. It feels less like a weapon and more like a memory." I took the ration bar she offered, the taste like chalk and synthetic vitamins. I looked at my hands, my scarred, calloused hands that had spent 20 years holding weapons. They were shaking. Not from the cold, because the Jade Veil was a furnace, but from the sheer weight of the transition. "We're in the pipe now," I said, using the old orbital slang for being on the final approach. "If we trigger that beacon, we're inviting the whole sector to the party. We won't know if it's a friendly freighter or a Directorate hunter until they're locking the docking clamps." "I know," she said, her eyes reflecting the dying light of the suns. "But we cannot stay in the cave forever, Soren. The soil here is beautiful, but it is not the soil I am meant to heal." I looked at her, seeing the transformation that had taken place. She had started as my assignment, a fragile piece of cargo to be delivered from point A to point B. Then she had become a partner, a voice in the dark. Now she was the navigator. She was the one pointing toward a future I hadn't even dared to imagine. I spent 10 years thinking that if I stopped moving, I'd be caught, I said, the words feeling heavy in the humid air. I thought survival was about the distance between me and the people who wanted me dead. But standing on this ridge, I realize it's about the distance between me and the person I'm standing beside. She reached out and covered my hand with hers. The golden light of her skin was faint, a gentle hum of warmth. You aren't a ghost anymore, Soren Voss. You are a man who chose to stay. That is a far more difficult thing to be. We spent the night on that ridge, huddling together for warmth as the forest breathed below us. The predators of the Jade Veil stayed clear, perhaps sensing the strange quantum resonance of the mycelium humming in Alara's veins. It was a night of long silences and short, fitful sleeps, haunted by the memory of the ship we had burned and the world we had left behind. At dawn, I stood at the highest point of the ridge. I unpacked the emergency beacon, a small battered cylinder that was our only hope in our greatest danger. I looked at Alara. Ready to make some noise? She nodded, her skin glowing a brilliant, defiant gold. Let the universe know we are still here. I triggered the sequence. A needle of invisible subquantum energy shot into the sky, a silent scream across the stars. Now we waited. We waited for the cavalry or the executioners. The first hour was a test of nerves. Every rustle of the leaves, every cry of an alien bird, sounded like the hiss of a landing thruster. I sat with my carbine across my knees, the power pack reading 3%. One shot. I had exactly one shot left in the world. 2 hours. 3. The suns climbed higher, turning the clearing into an oven. Then, the sensor on the beacon chirped. Incoming signature. High mass. Atmospheric entry in T-5 minutes. Identify? I barked, my heart slamming against my ribs. Alara checked the small data pad linked to the beacon. It's not a directorate signature. The transponder is registered to the Wandering Star. It's an independent merchant vessel. A scavenger. A scavenger, I muttered, a grim smile touching my lips. Probably coming to pick over the bones of the Ghostlight. They're going to be disappointed when they find us instead. The ship broke through the clouds, a bulky, rust-streaked freighter that looked like it was held together by prayer and industrial tape. It descended with a series of loud, clanking thuds from its landing gear, the downdraft sending a storm of leaves and dust across the ridge. The ramp hissed open, and a woman in grease-stained coveralls stepped out, her eyes widening as she saw us. A battered soldier in dead armor, and a glowing alien woman holding a broken medkit. You the ones who sent the SOS? She asked, her voice like sandpaper. We are, I said, standing up and helping Alara to her feet. We're looking for passage to the outer rim. Independent space. The scavenger looked at the glowing gold in Alara's skin, then at the pulse carbine in my hand. Her eyes narrowed. That's a long haul, and a dangerous one if the directorate is looking for you. We have credits, Alara said, stepping forward, and we have information that will make your ship the most important vessel in the sector. The scavenger laughed, a short, dry sound. Everyone in the neutral territories has a story, honey. But you look like you've been through the meat grinder. She looked at me, her gaze lingering on the scars on my face. You're a contractor, aren't you? I used to be, I said, looking at Alara. Now, I'm just the guy making sure she gets to where she's going. The scavenger nodded slowly. Well, get on board. We're burning fuel just standing here. And put that carbine away. On my ship, the only thing we shoot are the boredom and the occasional engine flare. We climbed the ramp, leaving the Jade Veil behind. As the hatch sealed shut, cutting off the humid scent of the forest, I felt a strange sense of closure. The war with Kalen Veen wasn't over. He would still be out there, searching for the ghost of his sister. But the war within myself had reached a ceasefire. I sat in the corner of the freighter's hold, watching Alara as she began to organize our few remaining supplies. She looked at me and smiled, her skin glowing a soft, contented yellow. We're in the pipes, Soren, she whispered. Yeah, I said, leaning my head back against the vibrating bulkhead. We're in the pipe. The Wandering Star groaned as it tore itself away from the moon's gravity, heading back into the black. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 15 years, I didn't dream of the foxholes or the fallen. I dreamt of a garden, far away, where the air was sweet and the soil was alive. And in the center of that garden, I wasn't alone. 6 months had passed since we left the green hell of the Jade Veil. 6 months of drifting through the fringes of the galaxy, moving from one independent colony to another, always staying one jump ahead of the shadows. We had ended up on a world called Oasis 3, a dry, rocky planet on the very edge of the outer rim, where the water was scarce and the people were even scarcer. It wasn't a paradise. The dust got into everything. The wind sounded like a continuous moan, and the local authorities were more interested in their spice yields than in the political squabbles of the inner core. It was, in other words, perfect. I stood on the porch of the small, prefabricated cabin we had built on the outskirts of the main settlement. I wasn't wearing my tactical suit. I was wearing a pair of rugged work trousers and a simple cotton shirt, my sleeves rolled up to reveal the scars that were now just maps of a former life. In my hand, I held a trowel, not a carbine. The morning sun was a pale, gentle disk in a sky of dusty lavender. Below the porch, a small patch of land had been cleared of rocks. It was our first real attempt at a garden. Alara was already down there, kneeling in the dirt. She was teaching a group of local children, dust-covered kids with wide eyes and hopeful hearts, how to plant the first strain of the recovery mycelium. She wasn't using a Cortex bridge or a quantum lab. She was using her hands. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet morning, her skin glowing a soft, warm yellow. "The soil isn't just dirt. It's a conversation. If you listen to it, it will tell you what it needs to grow." She looked up and saw me watching. She didn't say anything, but the golden light in her skin deepened, a silent greeting that vibrated in my chest. I walked down the steps and joined her, kneeling in the dust. I began to clear away a cluster of stubborn weeds, my movements slow and deliberate. "You're getting better at that," she teased, her eyes bright with a mischief I hadn't seen during the days of the directorate hunt. "You might actually have a future in agriculture, Mr. Voss," I snorted. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Doc. I'm still just the hired help." She laughed, a sound that felt like the most important thing I had ever heard. "You haven't been the help since the day you burned your contract on the Ghostlight." I looked at the children, who were now carefully patting the earth over the small glowing spores. They didn't know about weaponized strains or orbital strikes. They just knew that for the first time in their lives, something green was starting to grow in the dust. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, metallic object. It was my old directorate identification tag, the one that listed my rank, my serial number, and my status as a Grade 1 asset. It was the last piece of the machine I still carried. I looked at it for a moment, the sunlight glinting off the cold alloy. Then I dug a small hole in the center of the garden and dropped the tag inside. I covered it with dirt, tamping it down with my palm. "What are you doing?" Alara asked, her voice soft. "Planting the rubble," I said. She reached out and took my hand, her fingers interlocked with mine. Her skin was a steady, beautiful amber. We stood there for a long time, watching the garden. Two refugees who had finally found the one thing the corporations could never manufacture. I looked back at the cabin, at the tea mugs on the table, and the blankets on the bunk. I thought about the man who had landed on Krios Prime 6 months ago. A man who thought that survival was a solitary act of defiance. I didn't recognize him anymore. I spent 15 years in the dark, thinking that the armor was the only thing keeping me alive. I thought that if I let anyone in, I'd be giving them a target to hit. I lived my life like a tactical retreat, always looking for the exit, always counting the cost of staying. But standing here, with the dust on my boots and the warmth of her hand in mine, I realized that the armor wasn't protecting me. It was burying me. We spend so much of our lives building walls to keep out the pain, only to realize we've built a prison where the only prisoner is our own soul. True survival isn't about the absence of danger. It's about the presence of something worth dying for. It's about the courage to be vulnerable in a universe that demands you be still. I've traded my pulse carbine for a trowel and my ship for a patch of dirt. And for the first time in my life, I don't feel like a contractor. I feel like a human being. I've finally learned that home isn't a place you find on a star chart. It's the person you choose to stay beside when the rest of the galaxy tells you to run. Ilara leaned her head against my shoulder. The children had finished their work and were running back toward the settlement, their laughter echoing in the thin air. "What happens tomorrow, Soren?" she asked. "We wake up," I said. "We make tea, 3 sugars for me, and we check the garden." She smiled, her skin pulsing a fierce, brilliant gold that seemed to rival the morning sun. "That sounds like a perfect plan." I looked out at the horizon, at the endless sprawl of the outer rim. Kalen Veen might still be looking. The directorate might still be hunting. But they were looking for a ghost and a scientist. They weren't looking for a man and a woman planting seeds in the dust. I have spent so much of my life guarding things. Cargo, installations, secrets. I guarded them with my life, but I never cared if they survived. I wonder, what are the things you have been guarding so closely that you've forgotten to let them live? Is there an armor you are wearing that has become too heavy to carry, yet you're afraid to take it off? Who is the person you would stop running for if you only had the courage to ask them to stay? I let go of her hand, but only to put my arm around her waist, pulling her close as the first green shoots of the mycelium began to glow softly beneath the soil, a bioluminescent promise of the world to come. I picked up the watering can and poured a steady stream over the spot where my old life was buried. "Would you like me to show you how to plant the next row?" Ilara laughed and took the can from me, her eyes reflecting the infinite possibility of the morning. "I think I can manage, Soren. Just make sure the tea is ready when I'm done." I smiled, turned toward the cabin, and walked away from the soldier I used to be, heading into the house where my home was waiting. The dust of Oasis 3 blew across the porch, but the garden stayed firm, rooted in the rubble of the past and the hope of the future. A single glowing blue flower began to unfurl its petals in the morning light.